in this brief video, we will look at solutions to those problems that we have encountered in the previous videos. And the solutions are basically tools at the disposal of government regulators, government competition authorities. And the really big players in this realm are the European Union's Directorate General for Competition and the US Department of Justice and FTC. But for example, the UK Competition and Markets Authority is also really important for people living here. So in the remaining parts of this video, we will first basically look at how do they identify that there's a problem? How do they find out? And then in the second step, we will look at potential solutions. So what kind of remedies are available for to fight monopolies, cartels, etc. So how do the regulators detect that there are cartels and fight this kind of anti-competitive behavior? Well, in the end, once it comes to sort of a court case, there often has to be hard evidence of collusion. And this is in many cases based on company documents that document some sort of behavior, or in the case of the German auto cartel, there were the slides from the meeting of the engineers where they coordinated the size of the additive tanks. Or this can be based on wiretapping, like in the lysine case. And we've recently heard that Google has basically instructed all their workers not to use terminology that could be interpreted as abuse of market dominance. So don't crush other companies, etc. So certain language is being purged in order to avoid prosecution. But before this sort of hard evidence investigation kind of stage, legal stage, of course, economists have to look at the markets that these oligopolists or monopolists are operating in. So the first indicator usually comes from market concentration. How concentrated is a market? How many firms are there that produce a certain good? And for that, you first need to define a market. What is a market? And once you have done that, you can basically measure concentration. And the sort of standard measure for concentration in a market is the Hervindale-Hershman index. And the Hervindale index is basically the sum of all the squared market shares of all the companies in the market. So, as an example, I went and had a quick look at sort of market shares for search engines in 2020. So this is Google with 92%, Bing with 2.4%, Yahoo with 1.64%, Baidu 1%, and so forth, right? And so if we were to calculate, we calculate the Hervindale-Hershman index for this, we basically end up with 0.92 squared plus 0.024 squared and so forth, and in total we end up with 0.86. And this Hervindale index, it varies from 0, perfect competition, to 1, one company dominates the whole market. And the search engine market, which as we can see with our own eyes is very concentrated, of course, scores at 0.86, so 8,600 points in the Department of Justice language. And that's pretty high, of course. So the threshold for the US Department of Justice to basically engage sort of in merger control when there's two companies that would form a company that is bigger than that is not 0.25, so a lot less than this. And in general, if we think about the Hervindale index, basically a value below 0.01 is basically a market that is highly competitive. Between sort of 0.15 and 0.25 is moderately concentrated, and above 0.25 is highly concentrated markets. The lysine market that we had on the slides a little bit before with these obscure chemicals basically had a concentration of 0.35. So we don't need the sort of extreme cases to get to the cartel. And once you have sort of identified the market and have identified that there's concentration, you can of course look at the behavior of companies and try to get sort of to the point above, to the finding evidence of collusion, for example, through documents or wiretapping. So once you have sort of identified the problem and said, okay, we have a monopolist here, they are engaging in bad behavior, we have found evidence of a cartel, then basically there's antitrust laws on statute that the competition authorities can use to do something about these problems. And in the US, for example, this is based on originally the Sherman Act of 1890, and then the Clayton Act of 1914, where basically this is the age of the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the fabulously rich robber barons that sort of controlled whole industries, from the oil, well, all the way to the railroads, to the refineries and so forth. And basically, the American government said, "Okay, enough of this. We need to step in," and sort of, for example, broke up Standard Oil, back in the day. And the U.S. authorities, so the Department of Justice and the FTC, are still two of the big sort of players in the antitrust market, because many companies, of course, have an interest in selling in the American market, and so if you want to do that, you have to basically comply with the rulings from these regulators. And the second big antitrust sort of competition authority in the world now is basically the EU, the European Commission, that they have Articles 81 and 82 that regulate, that define all sorts of anti-competitive behaviors that they can investigate and fine companies, etc., or prevent mergers and so forth. So what can these regulators do? Well, basically the goal is often to make the monopoly industry more competitive, right? So you want something that resembles a competitive market. So one of the more radical solutions is, of course, to break up the monopolist and say, well, your company is going to be split into smaller parts. And this can be either sort of vertical or horizontally. And this is exactly what happened to Standard Oil in sort of early 20th century. But we can also think about sort of electricity providers or telcos. Some of the American airlines back in the day have been split up. And so this is still a tool that is available. And last week, when there was talk of sort of this antitrust investigation into Google, there has been discussion of whether Google could be split up, of course. So breaking up monopolies or market dominant companies, regulators can prohibit mergers. So if you're a company and you're trying to merge with another company, you have to announce this or refer this to the competition authorities. And in cases where this would create a market dominant position, the regulator can say, or sometimes the Minister of Finance, depends on the exact sort of structure of the government in question, can then basically step in and say, no, this is not allowed. You can't merge with your competitor, for example. One recent case of this is the case of Ryanair. Ryanair wanted to take over Aer Lingus, and basically the regulator said, no, you can't do this. You would create basically a monopoly for flights into Ireland. So breaking up monopolies, prohibiting mergers, what else can we do? Well, we can regulate the behavior directly. So if you're thinking that the problem is basically related to price fixing or to the monopoly charging too high prices, you can regulate the prices. The monopoly quantity and price is not efficient quantity. So you can, as a government, step in and sort of force it to the efficient level. The problem, of course, is in knowing what the efficient level is in this case. You can regulate other behaviors as well. So you can, for example, outlaw certain practices such as resale price maintenance or the bundling of products. This is something that Microsoft got into trouble with, of course, when they said, okay, well, we have our operating system, we have Office, we have a browser, all these things coming at once. And this is something that surely Google and Apple and others will face again in the future. So you regulate the behavior of these dominant players. Another good example for this is roaming. So one of the reasons, the reason why roaming charges in the EU were dropped is basically because the European Commission has intervened and basically told these telecommunications providers that they can no longer charge people these astronomical roaming fees. Once so you can break up monopolies, you can prohibit mergers, you can regulate behaviors. Of course, once people have engaged in behavior that is illegal, there can be fines and there can be criminal charges. So forming a cartel and sort of writing it down will get you into trouble, and in the worst case scenario will get you to jail if you're a CEO. And several high-ranking executives of the German car industry are facing jail sentences at the moment. In other cases where there's, for example, where there are natural monopolies, so thinking what's these water providers, for example, or the London Underground, there's nationalization, and this has been done, of course, in the past in many cases. That basically, for example, the underground railway providers have been nationalized into one company. This can take the form of sort of direct regulation or direct nationalization of the whole thing, or, for example, of the network. So in the UK, the government retains control of the rail network, for example, although it allows competition between private companies to sort of bid for specific routes in terms of the actual company providing the railway services. The network remains in government hand. You can also do nothing. If you think that the cure is worse than the problem at hand, you don't have to do anything. And if you think about sort of innovation rents and these kind of arguments, there's basically or was maybe a large school in economics, Chicago school, kind of where people were very convinced that sort of government intervention, even in these markets with anti-competitive behavior, was bad. And this is one of the reasons we have seen a lot of deregulation and a lot of growth of maybe also oligopolies in some sectors. And this gets us sort of to the last point. Political interference, so political economy type questions. So the government and the regulators are also not necessarily sort of benevolent players. So the first question is, of course, who complains about the anti-competitive behavior? Well, probably the potential competitors. And we've seen several cases of sort of Google and Microsoft or Apple, etc., duking it out over, via competition sort of complaints, basically. The other question, of course, is sort of political influence. So, like I just mentioned, the sort of the dominance of the Chicago school in sort of a more economic approach to what to think of monopolies and cartels, etc., versus a more lawyerly approach is one of the things that has led to deregulation and to less enforcement of antitrust action, for example, in the US since roughly the 80s, since of Reagan, etc. So there has been a huge influence of sort of political actors on this bureaucracy, on this independent regulatory bureaucracy, partly through sort of guidance and steering, partly through staffing or funding. So regulators are not completely independent, of course, and do face political pressures. And this is what some people are saying is happening with Google at the moment. So the Trump administration wants sort of to show that it's going after the big tech, which they think is maybe liberal or whatever. And so one of the reasons perhaps they are going after them now is, of course, to score electoral points. So in sum, competition authorities have awesome powers, but the question is when they use them and whether they use them, and of course these sort of political interference questions loom large in some cases. You should now have a pretty good idea of what these competition authorities can do, and we have seen some examples of specific cases. But what I would recommend is you take 10 minutes or half an hour and sniff around the websites of either the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK or the European Commission, DG Competition, or the DOJ Antitrust Division, and look at some of their recent cases, or maybe at the regulator in your country if it's not one of those. And look at some of their recent cases. They all have lists where they show basically, or their press releases at least, where they show sort of their work. And this makes for fascinating reading. So have a look at some of these cases. I promise you will be entertained. At least if you're entertained by that kind of thing. And it will also be helpful for this week's seminar.